Good to go? Okay, hello everybody and welcome to this SSRG.
Recording in progress.
Welcome to this SSRG hybrid roadshow. We are coming to you from the Perth and Kinross Yes Hub in the centre of Perth. And we have a Zoom panel as well, gathered from just about everywhere. And tonight we're discussing the subject of independence and security in an independent Scotland. And we have two speakers. Here in the Yes Hub in Perth, we have Andrew Parrott, former Lieutenant Colonel in the British Army and co-author of a paper called Defence in an Independent Scotland, Security in an Independent Scotland.
Something like that.
Yeah, so like that. I've read it more recently than you have.
It was 9 years ago.
And joining us on Zoom, we have Cliff Purvis, who is part of Veterans for Indy. So hopefully the guys will be able to give you 5 or 10 minutes of useful information and insights, and then we'll open discussion to the floor. So over to you, Andrew.
Good evening, thank you very much, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak. I'm a little bit surprised. I wasn't expecting to do a sort of formal presentation, but rather to sort of answer questions and take part in a discussion. But I will seek to give some broad thoughts, if you like, for a few minutes, and then perhaps those can lead on into a discussion. The first thing I'd say perhaps is we are not seeking independence in Scotland, of course, in order to defend and secure Scotland. But we're seeking independence for Scotland because it's a good thing for many, many other reasons. But consequent on becoming an independent sovereign nation, defending and securing that nation becomes the responsibility of the Scottish Government, and it needs to be attended to with considerable thought and care. After all, they say that keeping your population free from fear and free from want are the two basic considerations for any state. I would say that we must look to what type of defence and security structures we want, consistent with being a small North European maritime nation. There are perhaps various ways of doing that that might, if you like, be thought of as emerging from a previous British structure. But I think we ought to look wider than that and look to what many other small states and nations do, if only so that our consideration is complete, and that we eliminate the things that we don't think are suitable for us. One thing that I get very exercised about is the whole matter of nuclear weapons. There is far too much of a tendency, I believe, whenever defence is mentioned, to immediately say, oh, we must get rid of Trident. Yes, perhaps we should. But the removal of nuclear weapons from Scottish soil and space is actually, to my mind, a foreign policy issue. It's not a defence issue at all. It's how we interact with the owners and what they do with them. And in that light, I think we can learn a lot from the Estonians, a country I lived in from 1999 to 2003, as the first British service person to serve in newly independent Estonia. They had the, by then, Russian nuclear submarine base at Paldiski, and they were faced with, if you like, the similar issue of wanting it gone. And I'm not going to explain, if you like, just exactly what happened now. I'm happy to go into that in discussion, but in the end, it went. And Estonia was left without the nuclear submarine base on their shores. It has to be apparent to all of us that the European defence and security environment has changed massively, I think, since February the 24th. Perhaps it was changing before that, but in many ways that has brought it home to us in spades if we hadn't already appreciated it. And we have to be careful about the lessons that we draw from that conflict. But it is without doubt, to my mind, the largest and heaviest conflict we've had in Europe since 1945. It's being fought on a scale that nothing since 45 has been fought on in Europe. There are some very interesting, if you like, technological changes. The importance of drones on the battlefield, the importance of top attack weapons for armoured vehicles are changing the nature of that land warfare. And indeed the air warfare, and probably the naval warfare as well. So we have to look carefully and learn the lessons. But one of the things that is immediately apparent to me is that Sweden and Finland, which have been resolutely maintaining a neutral stance ever since the Second World War, have all of a sudden decided that the NATO umbrella is probably something that they could benefit from, and are taking steps to join. I had a Finnish boss in Estonia. I was in Estonia as the Cold War was considerably easing in 1999, and he said, it was always Russia on our border, it is Russia on our border, and it was the Russians who invaded us in 1939, 1940. Nothing has changed for us. And it's still apparent that the Finns can put 500,000 people into uniform out of a population of 5.5 million inside a week. UK can't do that with a population of 65 million, but that's because they choose a particular type of defence force, which is very different from ours, but that leads back to the discussion on what sort of defence force we might have. And so, going on from that, it's very interesting what has been happening in the Republic of Ireland recently. The Republic of Ireland is not looking towards NATO at the moment, it seems. The Republic of Ireland has always, in the last 50 years, since it truly stood up as an independent state following the Second World War. I know it was independent before that, but its links with the UK diminished, and the Irish Free State in a sense became the Republic, and constitutionally they have always adopted a fairly minimalist defence posture. But actually there's an Irish government report into defence that has emerged recently, where for the first time they are looking, for example, of upping their navy in terms of the largest vessels they have at the moment are ocean-going patrol vessels. They're looking at small frigates. They're looking for the first time at having their own modern combat aircraft, air defence aircraft. I say modern because they have had a few in the past. They're looking for the first time at an army that perhaps has the weapons for higher intensity conflict that could be used in, if you like, full-scale warfare, as opposed to the peacekeeping and peace-forcing operations that the Irish Army have very usefully conducted within the UN for so many years. So I think that there are very, very many things that we need to look at. I don't think that the 2012-13 document, White Paper on Independence, actually was a very good expression of Scottish defence needs or requirements. I think there's a lot of basic work that needs to be looked into against what are the missions and tasks for a Scottish Defence Force before you start looking at what structures and organisations and equipments and manpower levels and the mix between full-time manpower and reserve manpower that you need, before you start getting into some of the detail about what you'll call the units, where they might be based, which bases you'll retain. There is a lot of initial work to do. However, we associate ourselves in many ways with our neighbours across the North Sea in Scandinavia, and I think there is a lot of useful work that we can look at in terms of the scale and size and structure of the Danish Armed Forces, the Norwegian Armed Forces. We can look to other small countries like the Baltic states. We can look to other countries like New Zealand, which have a smaller population than Scotland and a very small armed force, but they have a very, very clear approach to how they organise their armed forces and what tasks each component has. I'm more than happy in discussion, if you like, to outline my own thoughts about what sort of scale and size we should have for our armed forces in outline, based on what relationships I think we should have, and what scale of effort we should make. But if you like, I don't want to say too much about that now, because really I'd like to that, if you like, to perhaps emerge out of discussion. The paper to which Jeff refers, it was written in 2013 with an academic from Glasgow called John MacDonald. I'm not in touch with him at the moment. He did most of, if you like, the academic work associated with that report. I did the more defence-y sort of stuff of applying structures and sizes and organisations to a model for the armed forces that went with that report. We had our 15 minutes of fame with it in the press. Ruth Davidson dismissed us as traitorous because we were suggesting leasing Swedish fighter aircraft a bit like the Czechs do, but I see nothing wrong with that. That to me is a far more useful sort of air defence fighter than Typhoon, which is hugely expensive and not really what we want. And in a way, I'm delighted that I think that paper has stood the test of time. There are certainly differences I would make in that paper now, reflecting the technological change, the increase in the capacity and capability of drones, the fact that probably an independent Scotland will have a border that's not quite completely open to the south, and other small changes in emphasis, but I still think that the overall size and structures that we were looking at then remain largely relevant today. And yes, if when you get down into the detail afterwards, there are vital things like if you're having a certain size of armed forces, the things that most people don't think about but the military professionals have to think about, and I'm thinking here of the German General Rommel's comment in the Second World War, that when the generals engage, the quartermasters have already privately decided the outcome of the battle. It is very true, but it is of vital importance. It's not just how many men and women we have, what equipments we have, it's what logistic stocks we have behind them, what bases we have, what sort of reach we want with transport aircraft, all of that sort of thing that is important. How the armed forces relate to the civilian structures from the society they come from. When I went to Estonia, a country of 1.25 million, they had a small navy, they had a coast guard, they had maritime police, and they had customs vessels as well. 4 state organisations defending Estonia from the sea. That they have considerably rationalised that now, which is only sensible. But to my mind, again, when we're looking at the size and scope of the armed forces, we want to be looking at what are the boundaries of their engagement. I have a view, for example, that all aircraft that a Scottish government needs to employ are actually formally within the ambit of the air component of a Scottish Defence Force. They might be flown by Air Force pilots, but their day-to-day tasking might be for the police. It might be for a Coast Guard function. It might be for search and rescue. So we want to make the structures as lean and as efficient as possible. But that I think is perhaps enough from me just now, and I'll throw the floor open to others. Many thanks.
Thanks for that, Andrew. Before we move on to Cliff, who I noticed nodding at quite a number of the things you were just saying there, I must say that the 2012-13 paper sounds awfully similar to what the Irish are doing now. Anyway,
Well, yeah.
Let's maybe come back to that. But anyway,
Perhaps they read it.
Sorry. So hand over to Cliff.
We'll have to unmute himself.
You'll need to unmute yourself, Cliff, according to David. You ready to go?
Yeah.
Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Right. Good evening, folks, and first of all, thanks very much for the invite. Over at Veterans, we don't take these things lightly. It's always an honour to speak on behalf of veterans and serving personnel at these type of things. Because, like Andrew, I was nodding away there. I'm sure Andrew's actually read my script for tonight because he mentioned quite a lot of what has been discussing with veterans and the armed forces serving. So, Scottish Defence Force, guys, what role, and Andrew has quite rightly identified that any role we are involved in is the political side of things. Are we? I don't see much in the way for being non-aligned. But could we go sort of Nordic defence cooperation, part of NATO, the UN peacekeeping? Having done Bosnia in '93, I can assure you that sometimes to keep the peace, one has to win it first. So we need a robust military. How do we fill the ranks? It's just all questions I'm getting from the forces community. Do we go with conscription? Not too good an idea. Or is it going to be the volunteers as we are now? Now, everybody in a forum has their own opinion, and this is why we have forums. But we will need a defence force. And as such, some of the comments that we get popping up about, not having a defence force is just actually a non-starter. I did 24 years with the Army, 14 years infantry, 10 years Royal Army Medical Corps. Since 2013, I've been involved with the veterans, and in the last couple of years, the S&P have actually set up Armed Forces and Veterans Group as well, that I'm moderating on that one as well. The question that often gets asked to us is, how could Scotland afford to defend itself? And the people that are asking this question, I think, are asking the totally wrong question. What I think they're trying to do is they're trying to figure out how Scotland can afford to defend itself given the RUK model and not any model that Scotland decides to adopt. Because if you look to comparable countries, Denmark's been mentioned, New Zealand's been mentioned, yeah, they have all got first-rate defence forces. Yeah, and it's certainly within our capabilities of doing that. We are in a very desirable place in the world as part of the unsinkable aircraft carrier that is this big island in the archipelago of mainland Europe. We have natural resources, and our zone of economic interest is going to be absolutely massive, and Andrew's touched on the use of drones, and that's certainly where these things would play into the work. having the drone aircraft investigating things out there. Our Scottish service personnel have a well-earned reputation worldwide. It's a reputation earned both on the battlefield and on humanitarian duties. Right? Units that I've served with, working alongside NATO countries, they absolutely love having the jobs, as we're professionally called, working alongside them. So what I've been concentrating on for the last couple of months is actually speaking with serving personnel. And because they are serving, they've had to sanitise them, sanitise their responses, so there's no way that anybody can guess who's making the comments. Yeah. It really does fall into, if we're going to convince those in the service community, that's the regulars, the reserves, their families, the veterans that makes up that community. If we're going to convince them that voting yes for an independent Scotland is a good thing, then we're going to have to present them with this robust and fit for purpose Scottish Defence Force. Yeah, it's got to be able to combat the cyber threat. And, you know, were we talking about that in 2014? I don't think we really were. But certainly that protection, as I've mentioned, of our exclusive economic zone. Our coastline is absolutely massive, and the figure I'm going to read out to you is from the high water mark, which is 18,672 kilometres of coastline. We've got to be able to watch out for our airspace, and Andrew's absolutely spot on. We do not need to get embroiled in the procurement as the MOD does just now. There is really, really good defence systems on the shelf, so to speak, and Swedish are past masters at making very good aircraft. And for the maritime side of things, the French have got a lovely modular frigate, I believe it is, that you can, you know, dial it in what you want and they'll build it to your specs. So that's all gone through research and development, so we're buying the finished product, which again will cut down on the cost of things. We have allies abroad. Scotland will have friends abroad, and of course we'll have commitments with them, so we've got to be able to do that. Again, Andrew mentioned the lift capability. How would we get our forces into theatre? It would be considerably easier if we were part of NATO, because there is the NATO heavy lift element that we get into it. As we've both mentioned, this is not 2014, and the world has moved on, and kit has become obsolete in that short space of time. So what I'd like to deal with just now is the comments from the service community. Now, most of the conversation on defence in an independent Scotland has focused on the strategic level. This is hugely important, but there must be a parallel focus on the operational level also, because this is where most of the serving personnel and the veterans will focus. This will be crucial in ensuring that the Armed Forces community support the independence movement. They have to believe that the Armed Forces in an independent Scotland will be a hugely attractive proposition. If we don't get this right, there'll be no soldiers, sailors or aircrew to man our defence force. Yeah. So some of the comments from the serving personnel, I'm talking to people that have 4 generations across the time serving both in the Army and the RAF, and one in particular is 3 generations still in the forces. Right. The first point, obviously, that is always dear to veterans anyway, is the pension side of things. Now, just so we're absolutely clear, if you ever get asked this, the military pension is a contract between the individual and the MOD. Yeah? And it doesn't matter where you live in the world, you will receive your pension. I believe there's some things about increases in the pension that won't apply to you if you don't live in the RUK. But our pension is secure, and Carl Monaghan, MP, got that answer, and I believe it is on Hansard's in the House of Commons as well. Right? So we have to let the boys and girls know that their pensions are safe. Yeah? But it's got to be answered beyond doubt. We will struggle otherwise. For those serving, will the current pensions they're paying into, will that be a straight transfer over to Scottish Defence Force? What will the pension look like? If this can be an improvement on what is currently on offer, then so much the better. But at the very least, it has to match the prospect. Yeah? The pay and allowances. This thing about serving God, Queen and Country and all that stuff is a very Americanized way of doing things. For myself, it was because I left school with no qualifications and I had a limited choice of where to go to work. So the pay and allowances is a very prominent thing. It's same as in any job. Yeah. So again, will the current levels be maintained? Can we improve on it? Most certainly we need to match what's being offered to them. The offer itself, remember, people that join the military do so because they might like a little bit of edge in their life. Yeah. So what's on offer to the Scottish military? And that will then go back to what role will the Scottish military have? Will there be opportunities to serve overseas? Will there be opportunities to deploy with our allies? That type of thing. Whilst we're doing that, we've got to think that our UK will go out for a way to attract the personnel to stay with the UK Armed Forces. Right? Now, a very strong rumour floating about that as far as the infantry goes, because of manning levels, that they are going to be adopting a whole army approach. Right? So that means when recruits turn up at an infantry training centre, they'll be allocated to any battalion that needs them. So no longer will soldiers from across Scotland be automatically allocated to one of the Scottish battalions. Now this will also happen to the other three nations that make up the UK. Now this will actually have a negative effect on trying to prize people out of the Scottish regiments to join the Scottish Defence Force, because they will lose that unique Scottishness about them. So we've got to get this offer nailed out, and like Andrew, I think Defence was very poorly handled last time out. But we fortunately seem to be having another good crack at this one. So we've got to get this nailed as soon as possible. Recruiting and training, how will this physically be delivered? Currently recruiting is outsourced. Will this be the same in an independent Scotland? Now this has to be up and running day one of independence. It must be a slick process which ensures the right people are recruited and all responsibilities are also met. Where will the basic training be delivered? We must have a recruit training depot in Scotland. So that needs to be set up. Will it be a multi-cat badge catering for all recruits in the military? Officer instruction, where will that take place? Will it be a tri-service officer academy, or will it be divided into three services? Certainly I think Sandhurst, Dartmouth and Cranwell would love to get the money from an independent Scotland to put their officers through them. But what about the career courses as well? Where are they going to be held? These are things that Scotland need to be starting to think about just now for us then to go into the communities and start chatting to the veterans. Next, one very close to my heart is the Forces Covenant. Right? A huge amount of great work has been done in Scotland in the delivery of the Covenant in local authority areas. The Veterans Commissioner has been a huge asset in support of the veterans' cause, but more obviously still needs to be done. There must be a whole Scotland approach to the delivery of the Covenant, which must be enshrined in law. And this must go hand in hand with the support to our regular and reservist personnel, especially when it comes to employer engagement. At the end of their term in service, we need to have employers out there that are fully aware that this person spent 5, 10, 15 years in the military, has got these skills, you know, get them interviewed, get he or she interviewed, have a chat with them, see what a wonderful person they are. So we've got to engage with the employers as well. Tied in with that, of course, is the medical help. Now, the Forces Covenant, when we talk about the Forces Covenant, nobody in the Forces is asking for priority treatment. We certainly don't want that. We just want that which was promised to us, that we would be looked after on our return from conflict. And they like so many other things, the RUK, they talk a good talk, but fail to deliver. They do it across the board, not just in defence. But the medical support needs to be there for serving personnel and veterans. We don't have a military hospital in Scotland. Probably the sensible idea for that one would be to set up one of the NHS hospitals with a military wing, and that way all people returning from operations or indeed injured operations side of things has the military backup to their injuries, so their needs are getting fulfilled. As I said, we've got to hit the ground running with these things to get things done. Interesting enough, some very senior officers within the British Army are actually looking at the leadership shown by Scottish Government over the past few years and liking what they're seeing. So they're coming round to the idea of an independent Scotland. Now, if we can get that cohort of officers speaking about independence, then that will filter down through the rest of the armed forces, and people will start talking about it more openly than what's going on. If we can get this right, then we can have, I think, a Scottish Defence Force that people will be proud to serve in, and if they're proud to serve in it, then we as a nation will be proud of it as well. And that's really all I've got to say at the moment. Anybody got any questions, Mark?
Thanks for that, Cliff. I wonder if we can, if we have any questions in the room to start off with. We'll maybe alternate between room and Zoom. Any questions in the room?
Wait for the microphone. No, just speak into it.
Obviously, having listened to the two gentlemen, and I see Andrew?
Yep.
Andrew here, and I'm sorry, I've forgotten the other, Cliff on the other side. The two gentlemen are coming from a very, very different perspective, and whilst Cliff, I understand what his interest is the existing armed forces and the existing veterans. Unless the strategy for Scotland is right, and then the existing armed forces will have to fit into that, and that has to be made an accommodation and have that appreciation. But unless we actually know what we're fighting, who's the enemy as far as this is concerned, and it's not just Russia. I mean, there is the potential for Russia to be an enemy, but in terms of defending a nation, we also need to be defending our nation against the possibilities of climate disruption, etc., which is exactly the attitude that the Americans are now taking in terms of their defence. It's not just about military, it's also about a whole training capability, a whole capability to bring resources together in the effect of having a threat. And so I'm slightly concerned that we seem to be going down a particular rabbit hole with a particular a determination that we already know, who the enemy is and what we're actually what we've already decided we're going to be doing. We don't know what percentage of GDP we're going to spend, for instance, when the UK spends 2% of its GDP. If you look at America seems to have a defence policy based on what does the military-industrial complex actually want the Americans to spend. There's a lot of things to consider, but I think primarily what are we actually defending ourselves against is the first question that has to be very clearly answered, and then taking it from there.
Thank you.
Yes. Go ahead.
Good
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
And that's, I hope, in a sense, what I alluded to. Before we get into discussion of structures, organisations, units, we have to be very clear from a political level what are the missions and tasks of the armed forces, precisely what are we there to do, and then it can be, if you like, left to a degree to the military professionals to develop the structures that attend to those missions and tasks. And in all of these things, if you like, you have to look at a timeline too. You have to have ready forces for the tasks that you think you might need forces for tomorrow. You know, assistance with humanitarian disaster, assistance with ecological disaster, that sort of thing is a fairly immediate task. General defence of Scotland might seem a very remote possibility. There would be a lead-up time, perhaps, to believing you have to do that, a bit like the UK had before the Second World War. But it means you have to have certain structures in place in peacetime that you can build on to develop that capacity. That, if you like, the core capacity has to be there to be built on. So it's a fundamental decision. Are we actually, as a mission for the armed forces, prepared for growth against a greater threat? If the government say no, then that actually is, I think, a mistake, but it makes it clear that you're limited to certain things. I agree entirely with Cliff that we have to make service in the armed forces attractive as a good employer that pays well and provides a good, honest pension and looks after people afterwards if they have suffered as a result of their service. That to me is a fundamental, and it's apparent to me that Scotland actually does better at looking after the veterans in many ways, for the British Armed Forces veterans, than the UK government does. We live up to some of the promises, not perfectly in Scotland, but better than elsewhere in the UK. And we have to have, if you like, the prospect of a good employment if we are to recruit and maintain a Scottish Defence Force. And it means that in peacetime you provide a career that has a degree of challenge and adventure. The British Armed Forces have always been big into adventure training in a way that other armed forces don't, for very good purposes. It prepares people for challenge and leadership in difficult circumstances. One area where I think I might differ from Cliff a bit, my experience of the developing armed forces in the Baltic states. I arrived in Estonia 8 years after independence. It's now 31 years after Baltic independence. It is only genuinely now that you can talk of mature armed forces against a given structure in the Baltic states. And there's no doubt about it that in the early years of Scottish independence, there would be a developing force structure, a developing armed forces. It is not something that, with the best will in the world, we would start off fully formed on day one. We would have to make clear choices about what the early priorities were against the most important tasks in each of the domains, air, maritime, and on land. What were the key things we wanted to attend to first as we built up the force structures? I hope that answers your question a bit.
Yes, to an extent. I do see it as a really big opportunity to actually give training to young people, in particularly the attraction being that if you're saying that it's wider than just purely military type defence, because actually, we're not at war presently, but we do have to have peacetime things that we're doing. So if there is, why can the Finns marshal 1 million people? It's very possibly they have some kind of military training as part of their...
It's because they are one of the only countries in the Western, if you like, Europe that maintains almost complete conscription. Everyone goes through military training and everyone has a role.
Cliff, do you have anything to add to Andrew's response to the question in the room here?
Microphones.
Yeah. No, I'm okay with that. Thanks, Andrew.
Thanks.
So could I take a question, please, from, is it Chris Terrell in the Zoom? Can you unmute yourself, Chris?
Yes,
Thanks.
that's right.
He's still muted.
You're still muted, Chris.
Oh, sorry.
There you go.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, first of all, thank you for the information you've given so far, both of you. It's been really interesting. It's exactly sort of tallied with a few queries that I've got about this. I spent a while in the Royal Navy quite a few years back now. My question is really what sort of comments you've got on the current and potential near future capability of Scottish industries to support both logistics and procurement, given that initially we might have to, as you I think very wisely mentioned, look at leasing options for good up-to-date and flexible kit from places like Sweden and France. I was interested to hear about the French frigate. That sounds very good.
Cliff, do you want to come in on this?
Yeah, I think our defence budget, like all defence budgets worldwide, will be very closely scrutinised. So I'm a firm believer in if the kit's there and it's good bits of kit, the research and development's already been done for it. Well, let's get that kit in and start using it. We can then license building stuff in Scotland under licence. That's always going on with defence equipment built under licence in the UK. We can start building up Scottish industry, but Scottish industry, like a lot of Scotland, has suffered from neglect. A lot of other aspects in Scotland suffer from neglect. So that again will take time to build up. I think there was a big hoo-ha about steel and the production of steel not being done in Scotland because we don't have the infrastructure anymore for that particular element of it. So we'll have to go to the shops and see what we need based on the tasking for the Defence Force. But yes, if the good bits of kit are out there, then let's get it. Yeah. I hope that helps you, Chris.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. Should we be...
Andrew, I was wondering what you have on that.
I was going to come in with a bit of a supplementary question, which is that a couple of questions really. One is, should we be starting to build some infrastructure now? That's kind of enough to be going on with, I think.
Agreed.
If we had to choose to build some, if you like, production infrastructure, what should we choose? What should we go with? I wasn't really asking Andrew. It was Chris was asking Andrew and Cliff.
No, that's a very good supplementary question, and I'd agree with that because I think in a number of areas, not just defence, that I really believe that we should already have been starting to make preparations in a number of areas, but this is obviously a critical one, and one which would in any case have benefits for the wider Scottish economy, regardless of the outcome of any referendums or processes.
Do we have any other questions in the room? Another question in the room?
One of the questions that's always raised on strategy for Scottish Defence Force is membership of NATO. I wonder if you would share with us your view on NATO and the possibility of a unified European Defence Force. Do you see that as a possibility of influencing and reshaping NATO's role and purpose?
Okay. I am very much in favour of Scottish membership of NATO. I make no excuses for saying that. I think it's entirely sensible, given where we are in the world and the nature of the likely threats that we would face. But that said, we can, within, if you like, the scope of membership of NATO, choose from a checklist of things that we might do and things that we might not do. The Norwegians have long been a member of NATO, but they won't host nuclear weapons on the Norwegian territory. It has always been, if you like, a matter of choice within NATO. I think NATO has, certainly after 1990, engaged in certain operations that, without doubt, go beyond the historical and establishing remit of NATO, and Scotland might not have chosen to engage with some of those. But where we are at the moment, if Scotland as an independent state was to be a member of NATO, and Russia was to remain the threat that it seems to be at the moment, I would want to see a Scottish government with NATO choosing to base, as part of the forward defence, components of the Scottish Defence Force in the Baltic states, like the Danes do, like the Germans do, like the British do, like the Canadians do, like the others do. Because to me, that is wholly part of the founding and continuing rationale of NATO. In other things, you know, the European Union. The European Union has a defence identity, but I think it's still true that Denmark chooses not to play a role in that defence identity. So there are tunes you can play around the fundamentals of membership. But I am more than persuaded that if the Finns and Swedes think that it's a good idea these days to be in NATO, then it's very, very difficult in my mind to think that it's good for Scotland not to be in NATO.
Cliff, do you want to come in on that one?
Yeah, wholeheartedly agree with Andrew on that. Having served in Bosnia under the UN, served in Bosnia under NATO, I can assure you the NATO force got a lot more respect than the UN did. And that's just from my own thing. But yeah, very recent history has shown that yes, NATO did start acting out of its remit slightly, but Sweden and Finland want to join NATO. It must be a huge indicator to everybody else that this is for Scotland. Obviously, with NATO forces deployed in Scotland, up in Lochmouth, Kinross or wherever, it will be good for the Scottish economy.
Guard the oil fields.
Yeah.
What oil?
So we should. That's run out, isn't it? So we have a question in the Zoom. I think that's is that Frank?
Frank's next, yeah.
Okay. Do you want to ask your question, Frank?
Yes, thank you very much. Like everybody else has said, I found your Andrew and Cliff's opening remarks extremely interesting because defence is one of my experiences in life, thank God. But I raised some points here, but I've tried to keep it short. Do you guys know, is there any other country that has nuclear weapons on its land or sea? They have them so close to a city in their country as we do. The Scottish government isn't sort of hasn't got a very good reputation regarding the so-called experts it engages with to cover a lot of subjects. Would you guys be in with a chance of assisting the Scottish Government with your ideas and how to conduct ourselves as a newly independent country? Finally, England, out of the UK, chose Scotland to house their nuclear weapons for the whole lot of us, I know. But after we're independent, that means we've got nuclear weapons that belong to another country, and if they were to take them home, we could use Faslane as a military base, for a conventional military base. That's my. I put a big question mark after that. What do you think of those remarks? Thank you.
Thanks for those 3 questions, Frank. Maybe we could go to Cliff first.
Well, I might not get another chance.
Wonder why.
Right, yes. Right, thanks for that. Yeah, right. Faslane is a lovely deep water port. NATO will be tripping over themselves to be able to use it. It is being touted as the home of the Scottish Defence Force, whether that's the HQ element or just the main structure in it. It would be really, really bad form if we didn't use Faslane as a military base. The nuclear weapons, as I've mentioned, nuclear weapons, we have them just purely because it's a big boy's toy. My own personal thoughts on nuclear weapons is probably the same as everybody else's. They are a drain on the defence budget, to say the least, and the sacrifices made throughout the rest of the military to accommodate those devices, to my mind, is very, very silly. Andrew touched on the extraction plan for the nuclear weapons in his opening brief, and that's a realistic statement. You know, when people turn around and say they want them out, you know, on independence +1 or wherever, you know, I think we've got to start living in the real world. Yes, they will go, but it'll be a phased withdrawal, which is better than no withdrawal at all.
Yeah.
Now, as for bases so close to major cities, I'm pretty sure the US has one of their, in fact 2 of their bases, one on the west coast, one on the east coast, close down to major areas of population. I'm not overly sure on the Russian forces, but I would imagine the Chinese have as well. Andrew's probably more in tune to that than I am. Over to you, Andrew.
To be honest, I haven't done any study on the comparative location of other people's nuclear bases with population centres. What I would say, though, is that there are, to my knowledge, I think, never any nuclear weapons at Faslane. This is something that people don't always appreciate. There are nuclear reactors in the submarines at Faslane because that's what powers the boats. But the submarines start and finish their patrols at Faslane, but at the start of their patrol, as I understand it, the first thing they go round to the Coulport missile depot and load. And the last thing they do when they return home is unload at the Coulport missile depot. And my understanding is that the real difficulty to relocating, as a London government might want to do, the nuclear deterrent force is not Faslane, it's Coulport. Coulport, when it was constructed, was, I understand, the largest single construction project in the European Union. It is a very substantial facility, with nearly all of it, I think, underground. So Coolport is the issue there. It would certainly be attractive to use some of the facilities at Faslane for a Scottish Defence Force. I agree with Cliff. We have to be very pragmatic, I believe, about when that facility might become available. But in terms of a base for naval assets of the type that Scotland might have, and I think it's probably sensible to make the point that you could build an entire Scottish Navy with all the craft it needs, and the total sum of the weight of those craft would be about one of the aircraft carriers that the Royal Navy has. So, if you like, we are talking about different sorts of vessels and a different scale. And the question I would ask is, why choose Faslane as a naval base, other than because the facility is there, when there are perhaps areas of the Ayrshire coast with port facilities that exist and can be developed, when Ayrshire is an area that needs more employment, and when Ayrshire is probably 75 miles closer to the oceans and seas into which those naval vessels are going to go, and on every deployment you save 75 miles heading out into the Clyde and the sea and 75 miles going home. Why burn 150 miles worth of fuel because you've chosen Faslane as a base? We're getting onto bases. It's always a good military principle that you always have a reserve, so we never want to have just one of something. Even a small Scottish Navy, I believe, needs two main operating bases, and in my view we would do best to develop a facility on the Ayrshire coast for the western base, and a facility in the northeast of Scotland for the northern eastern base. And Scupper Flow has very, very good historical precedent.
Well, thank you, Andrew. Thank you.
Thanks.
I think we're looking for another question. Okay, I have a question in the room here. Hold on a second.
Could I ask Andrew just on that point that he's brought up there? Andrew, what would you see the position of what Rosyth is, you know what it's used for at the moment? Would you see that fitting in with any programme?
Rosyth, as I understand it at the moment, is used by the MOD's contractors, Babcock, for various maintenance facilities. There is a very small Royal Navy presence at Rosyth these days. Rosyth is also in use as a commercial port to some degree. They're talking about re-establishing the ferry link from Rosyth. In fairness, I talked about two main operating bases for the naval component of a Scottish Defence Force. There may be other smaller facilities. I'm not sure that Rosyth necessarily has a major place in the basing policy for the maritime component of a Scottish Defence Force. Yeah, I'm not sure it's actually in the right place.
I've heard it said by someone who really knows that Rosyth is far too far up the Forth to be a decent ferry port as well.
Well, yeah, I've heard that too.
Yeah, it's too far inland. And as a resident of the Ayrshire coast, I'm not sure what I think about at the moment about bases in Ayrshire, but you know, all for it, I suppose. Have we got any more questions either in the room or online?
Yep.
We seem to be thinking, or rather ignoring any legacy equipment and bases that we would inherit from and RUK. The impression seems to be given at the moment that everything's a clean sheet. And no doubt in time that we will re-equip to suit ourselves, but surely there's a basis there for us to continue. The other point I might make is that there's been very little reference to cyber, and I think that if we don't have a strong cyber presence, then it doesn't matter how good our actual forces are, if we don't have command, communication, and the ability to direct them properly in a severe cyber environment, we're wasting our time. You were in some time in Estonia. My understanding of Estonia is that they've virtually digitized the whole damn country. So I think that would be a number one before anything else. Could I just make one last point? My understanding is that Rosyth is building the type 31 or 26 frigates.
No.
There's a double thing there.
My understanding is that they might be built on the Clyde and fitted out at Rosyth as the aircraft carriers were. If I can say a bit about Estonia, yes. Estonia is probably the most wired, although technology doesn't rely on wires these days, but we use that phrase, don't we? The most wired country in Europe. And I don't think it's any accident that NATO's cyber security centre is in Tallinn. You know, Skype was initially an Estonian invention. Tallinn has a number of boutique software houses that they are very, very good at their cyber. And without a doubt, within the structures of a Scottish Defence Force, cyber defence is for any modern armed forces an important component of that.
The overreaching component.
It depends what you're doing. There are many functions where the number of boots on the ground is of fundamental importance. And you go back to low-tech requirements for needing people to do simple things sometimes, or more complicated things, but it's people you need.
Cliff, you want to come in on this question?
Yeah, on the cyber issue, yes, it has been mentioned by the sergeant herself, and it is most certainly something that we need to, as a nation, be on top of, because it's not just us and north the assets that can get affected by it. We have seen, when I used to work in the NHS, I've seen attacks going in on the NHS computer system, and it really takes a sick mind to try and hack into that. So yeah, cyber security in an independent Scotland as a whole needs to keep current with the threat of perceived threats as well. The legacy equipment, it comes down to what, there was some figures banded about, some percentages banded about in 2014. It's sort of like 9.8% of the defence estate would transfer into Scotland. We want that kit. Is it still in date? The procurement within the MOD is absolutely atrocious at the moment. We only have to log into the National Audit Office to see a series of absolute clusters over the last 15 years with MOD procurement, both to kind of upgrade the boiler arm of the vehicle that have issues since 1991. We then decided to reinvent the wheel and develop the Ajax concept vehicle, and it's having horrendous problems. So do we want this aging kit that the MOD have, or are we? Yes, we will have to inherit some of it, obviously, but we should be looking to get the state-of-the-art off-the-shelf stuff, in my opinion.
Andrew wants to come in again on the legacy equipment.
Yes, thanks. There is no doubt that on any division of assets for an independent Scotland, Scotland may receive or be offered certain military equipment assets. There's no point in taking things we don't want, but there is perhaps a point in taking things that are only marginally useful, if you see what I mean. And the example I would use is that I think it was in Estonia, in developing a ground-based air defence capability, they were gifted by the Swedes some old Bofors anti-aircraft guns. They weren't what they wanted in terms of a modern equipment, but they were an equipment around which they could build a unit, develop that unit ethos, develop that unit's training, develop that unit's sense of identity, and then move on to another weapon system when they were able to afford it. So if you like, there is a logic to taking certain things, even if they are not exactly what you want or what you aspire to.
Okay, thanks for that, Andrew. We have a question on Zoom. Neil Miles, can you unmute, Neil?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's really a comment more than the question. I mean, I think Scotland actually has, in Applegate University, one of the world-class places for computer security. If you look at the results, sometimes you might think that's not the case, but so many of them get golden hellos before they get to the end of the course because they're actually so good that these folk are picking up tens of thousands of pounds to disappear. But I think Scotland has the basis of very good cyber security stuff there in terms of.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, thanks for that. More questions in the room, or?
Contribute more to an answer.
Wait. Do you want to ask a question?
No, I was going to say a little bit more about, if you like, the procurement bit, because that is a fascinating subject and a very, very important topic. I think it's fair to say that there might only be one country in the world that is entirely self-reliant for their military procurement, and that's possibly North Korea. There is evidence that even the Russians, in pursuing their conflict with Ukraine, are now facing difficulties because they are running short of components that they've chosen in the past to import for certain items of equipment, and they're now faced with the issue of having to build them themselves or make them themselves or source the raw materials themselves, which might be difficult. So if you like, the global world gets into defence as well. I was involved in an exercise in Kuwait following the conflict there in 1991. The Kuwaitis were building a new armed forces, and they were quite specifically building it with 4 brigades, each brigade reliant on imported equipment from different places, so that they were not beholden to any one procurement, if you like, route, or any one big country. I think that Scotland might end up being a bit like the Scandinavian countries in terms of defence procurement, in that both Norway and Denmark have niche military industrial complexes, if you like. The Norwegians have a speciality, I think, in anti-ship missiles. The Danes do something, but I can't for the moment remember just what it is. But they are both largely reliant on buying equipment that's available off the shelf. Developing your own is hugely expensive, but at the same time they contribute, if you like, to that wicked global arms industry, but because they have niche industrial capabilities that they can offer. And I think we have to remember, the Clyde has the military or the naval shipyards. Those are not run by the British government. They're run by Babcocks these days on for naval vessel building. It will be up to Babcocks to decide what happens to those in an independent Scotland, and as a commercial enterprise, it will depend what orders they get. And if Babcock are building vessels for other countries, perhaps other than an RUK, they may continue to go on building them on the Clyde. Who knows? It may suit them commercially. They have an expert workforce there, which they wouldn't have if they moved somewhere else. So we would have to see. But I don't think that there is also in Scotland, I think, quite a considerable avionics industry centred around Marconi and one or two others. So that there is actually perhaps more in terms of a military industrial complex in Scotland going into military procurement than most people think at the moment. Thanks.
So is your hand up to ask a question, Neil, or you need to unmute?
Right, I've just forgot to take it down. They usually disappear after a short time, that one has. Sorry.
No problem. More questions from the room or online? Oh, sorry.
Sorry. Can I go back to a question which Frank posed as about expert advice? One of the issues I have is that currently I don't see very much strategic information coming out of Scottish Government or the party of government, because it's UK defence is a reserved matter. So I'm not aware of what planning or what expert advice there is available in preparation for independence beyond what you've helpfully articulated this evening about 2012, 2013. What would be your view on establishing a group to provide expert advice in the lead up to establishing the Scottish Defence Force, and what would be the lead in time to have such a group advising?
Well, there is a group of us who I would say have previous experience, and Cliff is one of them, who are in certain discussions. But I would say I would claim, yes, I have quite a lot of previous experience. Just how much that represents expertise, I'm not sure. But I'm always very interested in defence issues and more than happy to contribute and seek perhaps to stick my oar in a bit, either if I'm asked or if I'm not asked on occasions. But I am very mindful of the fact that I left the military 10 years ago, and one's experience becomes dated, without a doubt. Thanks.
Cliff, you want to come in on that? You're muted.
Yes. That's why, Andrew, I wrote less than 2002, and that's why I'm sticking more to the veteran side of things. Although people I used to work with who are still serving are quite happy to chat to me on the quiet. But yeah, so I've been quite heavily involved with trying to get things sorted out for veterans, and as I mentioned in my bit, the Scottish Government cross-party as well, actually, let's be honest on this one, cross-party have been absolutely outstanding and rising to the challenge of untangling those at Westminster we'd rather forget, and trying to get our veterans sorted out. So yeah, I'm known to various MPs, and from time to time we do ask an opinion, but like Andrew, my time in the army was some time ago, so how relevant that is to the modern battlefield, is probably nil.
I'm not sure whether we have any more questions. Okay, I guess what I'll do is just thank both Cliff and Andrew very much for a very, very interesting presentations and discussion, and thanks to Perth Yes Hub for putting us up here. And just a reminder also that SSRG, we're continuing to run, I think we've got about 2 or 3 more roadshows on different topics coming up over the next few weeks. But we will be running what I realise is a very ambitious conference, since some of us here are kind of charged with organising it, on the last weekend of July in Dunfermline, covering possibly far too many issues, but you know, it will be extremely good. So keep your eyes open for ticketing and publicity information on that. Thanks, folks, for coming. Really appreciate it. And to the Zoom lot.
Thanks all, that's been very useful.
Okay.
Tend to go on.